On behalf of IFES, I'm very pleased to see so many people here today and to stick it out after what has probably been a long day. We really appreciate it, and we think this panel is going to be very exciting. I'm pleased to be here. My name is Jessica Huber, and I am IFES's Senior Gender Specialist. This is a newly created position meant to emphasize and consolidate the many years of IFES's commitment to gender equality and women's empowerment. Our work since 1998 has been in many areas, including gender mainstreaming in all of our projects, and for our partners, including the election management bodies and civil society organizations, advocacy and leadership skills, civic and voter education targeting women, research and surveys, including our Status of Women in the Middle East survey, adding a gender component to our bridge training, as well as looking at legal rights for women around the world. I'm here today to introduce a very important and timely issue in the US and around the world: women's political participation. Generally, we know that if we increase women's political participation, it's helpful to everybody. We develop stronger positions on issues, we create new groups of voters, and we strengthen the relationship with our constituents. Voter turnout in the United States in 2008 was 65%. Yet there still seems to be a gap in elected officials in the United States. For example, out of the 50 governors in the 50 states of the United States, there are 6 women. There are 17 senators out of 100, 76 congresswomen. In 2012, we have 1 candidate running for governor, 18 candidates that are women running for Senate. There has been some progress. It's not all bad news. A record 163 women are running for the House of Representatives. In 2012 campaign, we've seen a number of issues raised related to women, and I think that's shown us that these issues related to women are as relevant today as they have ever been in the United States. So we have the great panel here today with us to answer a central question: why, in spite of advances in women's political participation and the fact that women have equaled or exceeded men in voter turnout in recent elections, do women remain underrepresented in positions of power? Is it a lack of ambition or confidence among women, or an inability to reconcile family or life with political life? Are there visible barriers or a glass ceiling? What are the challenges for women to run for political office? I hope that each of our panelists can consider that question in their presentations, as well as a couple of other questions. What will it take to increase women's participation as decision makers and elected officials in the United States and around the world? What is unique about the 2012 elections and women's issues? And please, of course, the most important thing we'd like to hear from you is what has your experience been related to this topic? I'd like to ask our first speaker, who is sitting here next to me, Ann Lewis, who is the president of the No Limits Foundation, to talk a little bit about your experience. And you've had incredible experience as a senior advisor to Hillary Clinton's 2008 campaign for president, which must have been incredibly exciting, and given you a real insider's view into the decisions and sacrifices it takes to be a political candidate. Can you describe that experience for us and maybe tell us some of the conclusions you came to about women in the public sphere? I expect these played a large part in running the No Limits Foundation as well. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you so much, and welcome all of you. I'd say you are here for what I truly believe is going to be a historic election for us in the United States for a number of reasons, including the one that brings us here this afternoon, which is the issue of women and women's elections. First, as you heard from Jessica, we have a historically high number of women running for office this year. 18 women candidates for the United States Senate, 166 candidates for the United States House. To put this in some perspective, we have 33 Senate seats up this year. That is 1/3 of our Senate runs every 2 years. Of those 33 seats, 1 in 3 of the Democratic nominees are women. So we have 1 in 3 women running for the United States Senate. That's simply a number we have not approached before. You did hear we have only 1 woman candidate for governor on our side, but truth is we elect most of our governors on the off years, so it's hard to tell yet. Now, the second reason it is, again, I think historic, is the attention to issues that have until now been categorized as somehow women's issues and therefore of less importance. Although considering that women are the majority of the electorate, you might think they'd get bumped up a little. This year, attention to issues considered of principal concern to women has gotten, I'd say, close to the attention they deserve. And because I was out campaigning yesterday, I picked up a number of election materials that say what the 2012 election means for women. They didn't just give me this because I walked in the door. This is what was being given out at the Obama headquarters in Virginia, and forward, what the 2012 election means for women. So these are samples of ways in which, in this year, we are putting women's-focused issues throughout the campaign. And the third piece is politics, as you know, is about the bottom line. That's why I like it. It's about numbers. And if you can show you've got the numbers, you can do quite well. Women will be, once again, the majority of voters this year. We don't know exactly how many, and we won't know until tomorrow night. And in a few states, we might not know until a day or two after that. But we do know women will be the majority, and that's important. And again, means that women have the opportunity both to elect more women to office and to act on issues they care about. Now, having said all that, this is not a victory speech. I'm not here to tell you how well we're doing or that we don't need to do more. In fact, when you look at the number of women in office, it is not nearly proportionate to the population. 17% of the United States Congress are women. 17%. That is nothing to cheer about. But to use the language that you might hear throughout our campaign, I believe we are going in the right direction. And the question I'd like to talk about right now is, how did we get there, going in this right direction, and what is it we can do to raise the rate of change? So, my own historic landmark, personally, takes us back 26 years. This will seem to some of us a very short time, and then I see people here for whom that's going to be their lifetime, so I won't get into that. But 26 years ago, 1986, a friend of mine was running for the United States Senate. And I was out and about, as I often do, talking her up. And I will never forget a friend of mine at one of these famous Washington cocktail parties who all but patted me on the head and said, "You don't understand, Ann. Barbara Mikulski doesn't look like a senator." Well, by his standards, she didn't. She was short. She had somewhat longer hair than the senators at the time. But what struck me is, again, this was 1986. This was not the Dark Ages, and he didn't mind saying that out loud, because to him this was pretty obvious. Well, Barbara Mikulski won. She became, 26 years ago, the first Democratic woman elected in her own right to the Senate. So within 26 years, how have we changed? There are more women in the United States Senate today, serving today, than in all the year, had served in all the years until Barbara got elected. That's how quickly that has changed. How has that changed? A couple of factors, I suggest. One, not a coincidence, 1986 was the first year where we began an organization called Emily's List that you may have heard about or will hear about, which is basically a fundraising network nationally that supports women according to only two. You only have 2 criteria. You have to be a Democrat and you have to be pro-choice. That's it. It's not complicated. And what it did, the genius was, it enabled women around the country, wherever they lived, to support women who were running for office, who could make a difference in their lives. So you start with a national network that enables a lot of women to participate. Now, Emily has grown over the years. They now provide other services, including recruitment, If you have the faintest glimmer in your eye that you might like to run for office and they hear about it, they will send someone, as I have heard, to sit at your kitchen table and walk you through what a budget might look like and where you could go to get started, and have you thought of this question and who else can help? And they have inspired other organizations, somewhat smaller but along the same lines. That's one. The second is a series of external events that have really triggered change. The first is in 1991, when we had a Supreme Court nominee who had to be confirmed by the United States Senate. And in the course of that nomination fight, a lot of people discovered that sexual harassment was a very serious issue that had not been taken seriously before. And second, what they saw was an all-male panel of senators who were groping's the wrong word, I shouldn't have said that, who were grappling perhaps with this issue. So the sight there of this all-male panel made very real, in an important way to women, that they were excluded, even on issues that directly concerned them. Okay, that's 1991, we have learned. We come now to the year 2011. And once again, what do you know? We have an all-male panel, this time of members of Congress, members of the House, who were discussing the issue of birth control, an issue I would suggest that very few of them would have some expertise in. So once again, what you saw, mostly for women, men too, is, wait a minute, they're talking about my life, they're talking about my health, and I am not included in this conversation. External events like that, which really drive home to people what the exclusion of women from the public sphere means and why they should care. I would add reluctantly, but let's accept it, the fact that these two were public events covered by television, covered by the news, gave them additional credibility. This was not just my saying it from a particular partisan point of view. This was a fact that people saw in their newspapers. So I'd say those two events really helped accelerate the rate of change. Now, these are related. That is, in what I would call a virtuous cycle. When you have an existing network that can offer support and you have external events, the external event can encourage and inspire people to run for office. The network is there to support them along the way. The fact that the network is there may encourage more women to run for office. When an external event comes along, it boosts their campaign and their chances. The third factor, I believe, is the Hillary Clinton campaign of 2007, 2008. You know, human nature being what it is, it can be hard to imagine something, to want something you cannot imagine. So until then, Senator Clinton shows up on the stage, and you think, she could be president. She could be commander-in-chief. She sets an example for women that we didn't have before. Her candidacy moved the issue of women in the highest office from the hypothetical to, oh yeah, maybe we could do it. And so while she did not get all the way, as she says, she put 18 million cracks in the glass ceiling. You know, if you put enough cracks in a piece of glass, eventually it shatters. And the effect she has had on inspiring other women, encouraging other women, I think we're still seeing that. It's continuing to grow. So, again, to start with, a network that was formed and now exists for the purpose, networks, I should say with an S, to support women candidates so that wherever you live, you get support. A couple of external events that really raised the issue of women's exclusion from the public sphere so that it became something people talked about, we would say at the coffee table or at the water cooler. And a couple of some inspiring candidacies, again, I would say symbolized by Hillary Clinton. Now, everything I've said, obviously, is particular to our country and to our system, because remember, in the way we run, candidates run as individuals, and they are largely responsible for their own fundraising. Both of those are disincentives for women to run. In order to run for office under our system, you almost have to run against somebody, because you're running for a single-member seat. And again, you have to assume that you will be responsible for raising large amounts of money. It is easier in systems in which people can run as slates, as teams, as partners. But even with those disincentives, we have significantly, and as I say, historically increased the number of women. And I believe when the polls are closed tomorrow night, you all will be here to see by Wednesday, we will have had a historic gain in women in both the House and Senate. Universally, then, I would leave us with these. First, what is it going to take to increase the numbers? To answer Jessica's questions, one, simply crucial. Women have to be willing to step forward. They have to be willing to say yes for what I care about, for the issues that are of concern for me, for the life I want to lead, and for the life I want my children to lead. I'm going to be a candidate for office. That's what this is about. Second, we have to find ways to increase the support for those women, because as a candidate, you can feel very exposed and alone out there. We have to find ways to support them that are both personal and political. Because when you're doing something in a groundbreaking way, when you're doing something as a pioneer, you could use a lot of help. So with those two, adapted to whatever system we are, I think we can do it. I think we are on our way to doing it. Well, two last points. Jessica talked about women as decision makers, women in appointed positions. I gotta say, this is the simplest ratio of all. If you elect more women, you will see more women getting appointed. When more women get elected, magically, more women become decision makers. It's not quite like the moon having a draw on the tides, but I would say the political system does react. It responds well to the election of women, and you mirror that in the number of women who get appointed. And the last piece, we've been talking on and on about a democratic system and how to elect more women candidates. The good news is, if we do this, the voters are ready. Voters really like the idea, and I think Ann Stone, my friend, is going to give us more examples of this. Voters are more than ready. They like living under a system in which people they know, people they can look to, and again, feel would be friendly towards them, are holding positions of power, and they are more likely to feel that way about women. So we've got a lot to work with. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Anne. That was great. I think you touched on some very interesting and important points. We've got quite low proportional representation of elected women, but we seem to be heading in the right direction. Mm-hmm. And if we can provide the support networks for women candidates, we will see what Anne called a very simple equation. If we have more elected women officials, they will also bring along their colleagues, and we will have more women as decision makers. It's that simple. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Ann Stone, who's Senior Vice President for the National Women's History Museum. And we would be very interested to hear about your professional background, how you made decisions throughout your career, and most especially about your latest efforts to launch a National Women's History Museum. It is amazing to me that this museum is not yet open. Why is opening a museum so important to you and to women across the United States? Thank you.
I'm actually going to divert a little bit from that and bring the history part in at the end, because part of what Jessica may not know is, like Ann Lewis, I've been involved in politics for a very long time. In fact, my first political thought, I was age 5. The first time I got involved in politics, I was age 12. So I'm very political. I've been involved in over 500 campaigns and several presidential campaigns, so I speak from experience. And I've been blessed to be sent by our State Department around the world to talk to women and men all over the world about our electoral system, but also to inspire women to run for office. And it was actually in Slovakia where the women came to me and said, we're having a problem. When we run, we have women tell us not to run, as well as some of the men, but even more the women tell us not to run. And we still have that problem in the United States. There are still women who do not accept women running for office, but thank heavens in our lifetime, Ann Lewis and I have seen that that has abated quite a bit. So they asked me to put together a strategy. And they said, you know, you need to help us figure out how we can convince these women to support us. And the strategy is one that applies to all countries, our country, but all over the world. And it's points the men should take heed of as well, because the points of running women for office actually help your parties, no matter what party it is in what country. So keep this in mind when you're thinking about putting together a slate of candidates. Sometimes it's best to have women on that slate for these reasons. Came up with 5 reasons that women, it's not that they should run. why they must run for office in order for you to have civil society. 5 reasons, and I'll wrap the history part in at the end. First, and I have to start by saying I love men, so none of the reasons I'm giving are meant to put men down. I absolutely love men, so this is about women. This is not about you guys, okay? So I'm here to tell you why the women should be involved. Because the first reason is women are the more ethical half of the species. Women are the more ethical half of the species. I can cite all kinds of studies for you that show that that's true, and it doesn't matter if you believe me or not. Do you know why? Because your voters believe me. I gave this talk in Bulgaria, and the Bulgarians said, that's not true here. I said, oh, yeah, it is. Oh, no, it isn't. Well, 3 weeks after I gave the talk, the embassy emailed me and said, my God, they did a survey, and they found out that 87% of Bulgarians wanted to see more women in government to end corruption, because they believed women were more ethical than men in government all over the country. And in fact, the countries in the world that are most loved by their people, the countries that are held in the highest esteem by their own people, are the countries that have more women involved in their government. Generally, the Scandinavian countries, they always rank in the top 5. Second, and I should also, before I go further, my expanded talk on this is available by email. If you provide Jessica with your email, if you'd like the full talk, because I only have 10 minutes, we will have that sent to you by email. The second point is you want both voices at the table, male and female, when legislation is written. Now, I've done this talk in 66 countries now, and in one of the cases, they had a congressional delegation of female legislators sit with me while I was giving the talk to tell the people in the audience whether or not I was right, and they reaffirmed each of these points, by the way. And when I made the point about both voices being at the table when legislation is written, one of the legislators said, oh, I can give you all kinds of examples where the men are taking the legislation in one direction, and I'll wait, and then I'll say, well, do you realize that what you just wrote there would do this, this, and this to women and children? And the guys look at her and go, what? Or they'll say, do you realize you just left out this entire class of children? And they'll look at her and go, what? Now, this is not meant to say men can't write legislation by themselves at all. We're just saying having women at the table means you'll probably write better legislation together than either side would by themselves, because men and women have different perspectives on society, different perspectives, different life experiences, and will bring different things to the table. And again, you'll find legislators, and I've repeated this again in 66 countries, and I hear from female legislators all over, the same story told again and again, that in fact, when they are there, legislation gets changed because they're in the room. Third, you want male and female voices at the table when government money is allocated. They have different spending priorities. It doesn't mean that one's right and one's wrong. They're different. Both are valid. There needs to be balance. And in fact, as I tell the women, until women were at the table in the United States, women died as a result of not being at the table in the United States when money was allocated. Now, why would I say something outrageous like that? That's because the money that was allocated on the national level for testing, for medicines and for diseases, was all going to be tested on men, and it was about diseases that majority affected men, because they thought women were little men. Well, we now know, because women have been at the table, because testing has been done on women, that in fact, women are not little men. We are very different. That all of our symptoms for the same diseases tend to be different, and the medical regimens for males and females actually needs to change. Women have different symptoms, they have different ways that a lot of the diseases need to be treated. And things like osteoporosis and breast cancer were not being looked at until women were at the table, because they're diseases that are majority female. Fourth, you want women involved in the political process because it gives them skills that are good for your country. Women involved in politics gain a whole bunch of skills that make it good for them, whether they're in the public arena, should they decide to start businesses, or quite frankly, if they decide to stay at home. There's skills that they gather being involved that help them in all phases of their life, and it should be encouraged. Here in the United States, women represent, now I think we're at either par or majority of small business, and I do know this. Women's small businesses are being started and succeeding at a rate of 3 to 2 over male businesses. And that's a big part of our job creation. The last time I looked, 45% of all new jobs were being created by companies run by women. 45% of all new jobs were being created by women-owned business. And that number is only bound to increase. In fact, there are projections that it's going to greatly increase over the next decade. Fifth reason, perhaps the biggest reason of all, you want women involved in politics because, guys, we're the peacemakers. And in fact, our brains are wired for peace. That's one of the other things they found out. Male and female brains are wired differently. If I were to ask you what the difference was between a male and a female brain, first thing I always get is, oh, the male brain is bigger. Well, the male brain may have more mass, but women have more white content, which organizes the brain. Men have one connection between the right and left lobe. Women have several. They have hooked men and women up to machines and asked them the same questions and watched different parts of the brain light up. Men, you know how you can't understand us? Don't even try. You never will, because our brains are so different. It's actually easier for us to understand you. But in fact, they've done studies, I'm not just pulling stuff out of the air, that the way women approach conflict is dramatically different than men. Men with that one connection, right-left, much more linear, much more somebody wins, somebody loses. Women do not look at conflict that way at all. If you want more peace, elect more women. The UN recognized that. That's why they had their resolution 1025 of having women on all the committees discussing peace. Mentioned was the fact that I'm one of the founders of the National Women's History Museum, and I want to close by saying, if more women knew their history, more women would run for office. If more women understood the part they've played in civilization from the beginning, guys, more women would be involved. I could, in the next 10 minutes, give you 12 women that would blow your mind that you don't know, and they wouldn't even be American women. They'd be from all over the world. I encourage the men and women in this country from different countries to start women's history movements in your own countries as we are doing here. You know, I'll give you 2 examples. Dr. Lise Meitner. How many people here have ever heard of her? Dr. Lise Meitner. Right. She invented something called the theory of nuclear fission. She and her male lab partner were the first to split the atom. You know why you don't know her name? She wouldn't participate in the Manhattan Project to build the bomb, so they wrote her out of history. She spent the remaining years of her life in Sweden. She's a name we should know. She never intended her invention to be used for military purposes. Let's see, one of my other favorites. Man, there's so many. I'll do this one, a little far afield. Hildegard de Bingen. Anybody? Hildegard de Bingen? German? No? Nobody? Okay. Hildegard de Bingen was she was a nun, she was an abbess, she was the first to diagnose and treat many forms of illness, and she used so many plants and herbs, she started a classification system that was an early system of botany. But that's not even the biggest thing. I always refer to her as being one of the first Renaissance people in the world. She was born in 1075. She is the first known musical composer. 500 years before Mozart and Beethoven, her work is considered on a par with Mozart and Beethoven. If you listen to her work, and you can go get a record, you can go get a CD. She has 2 albums. One's called Tapestry, not to be confused with Carole King's Tapestry, and the other is called Illumination. If you listen to her music, which was composed for wind instruments and voice, it sounds modern. It sounds like New Age music. It's amazing. It's beautiful. It's angelic. First known musical composer. That's something we've only known now for about 20 years. There are thousands and thousands of examples from countries all over the world, as well as the United States. It's something we hope to illuminate the world on, because we think the more that both men and women learn about the place that women have always had, that both men and women will look at women differently, and it will create greater partnership between men and women. That's our hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joan. Thank you. I think we heard from Anne, in addition to a bit of a biology lesson, a quite strong case that there were examples from all over the world that it would actually inspire more women to get involved in history. Thank you very much, Anne. And finally, our last speaker, Carla Koppell, comes to us from USAID. She's the Senior Coordinator for Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment at USAID. And has a very rich history as well on these topics. Carla, I'm wondering, in addition to the topic at hand, it's maybe no coincidence that in 2012, the U.S. government launched its first ever strategy to prevent and respond to gender-based violence. In 2011, in December of last year, the U.S. launched a national action plan for women, peace, and security. I'd be curious to hear, which actually came, with an executive order from President Obama. We'd be very curious to hear your thoughts from your particular vantage point within USAID. Why have these policies come now? And indeed, I believe your position is also a first. Why now? And how do you think these decisions resonate with today's discussion? Thanks.
Thanks, Jessica. And I think I will do exactly what my colleagues did and come to the answer to your question at the end of my presentation. I wanted to, when I was thinking about all of you and the roles that you fulfill around the world, I thought about the issue of women's political participation as voters, as candidates, and as officials. And that there's this multiplicity of roles, which often means that if you're going to be fully effective at engaging women in political systems, you need to really think about how they're different and what their roles are in those different functions. We see now emerging, and Lewis mentioned it earlier, women as a voting bloc in the United States, and it's been very ever present in this campaign, and we can speak more to that in the question period if you're interested, how that's emerged as a central feature of the discourse here in the United States. But we've also seen it emerging in places around the world, such as Liberia, where President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf has said it really was women that brought her into office. And we see those kinds of trends in lots of different places around the world. At the same time, the trend we see in women's political participation in running for office here in the United States and the increases in the statistics in this election cycle are similarly seen around the world. We now know that about 20% of elected officials around the world in legislatures are female. We know that there are 17 countries that have female heads of government or heads of state, and those are historic levels. And if you look at the trend lines, those trend lines have been pointing in one direction, which is up over a number of years. So this is unlikely to go away or reverse. I guess we would cross our fingers and say we hope. Obviously, the numbers are still insufficient given the representation of women in populations around the world and the fact that notwithstanding the fact that women are a majority of the population globally and in many countries, particularly those that are recovering from conflict around the world, we only have one country in the world where we have a majority, and it's a very thin majority of women in elected office in parliaments, and that is in Rwanda. But we've heard something about why this matters, and I would just like to add to that a little bit. Obviously, there's a principle here, if we're talking about good governance and democracy, of having full participation and representation in that democracy. I think there's also compelling evidence that it makes a difference in decision-making. Now, I have a slightly different take on this than colleagues on the podium, but if you look at the evidence where we have it that is quantitative and deals with the difference women make in government, the best evidence of that is from India, where you have a set-aside on the panchayat level, which is the most local level of government, and you've had a couple of election cycles with a critical mass of women in local level government, and some really strong social science research to say, well, does it make a difference when you have these women at local levels? And what you see emerging is some really important evidence that it changes the way decisions are made, the priorities for funding. The priorities for funding shift because women are just charged with different responsibilities at the community level. So you see increases in investment in water and other social infrastructure, education, et cetera. Because you're bringing in a broader range of the population to make decisions. And so those decisions are therefore more broadly reflective of the views within those societies. But you also see some positive benefits that you might not have guessed. So you see an increase in aspiration levels for girl children. And in a country where you have a significant gap in births of male and female children because of male preference, that's important. Because what it translates to is a correction in the perception of girls vis-a-vis boys. It increases the education of girls, which has commensurate benefits for your economic development and economic growth within those societies. And so it leads to changes in developmental outcomes writ large. So you can make a very compelling, and I don't want to reduce the impact of the moral or ethical case for why you need to have women in these positions of authority, but you can also look at it from a very pragmatic developmental and representational case. The issue of whether or not women are perceived as more honest, whether they are more honest, is backed up by other analysis and polling data from different places in the world. You don't need to debate whether or not you think they actually are more or less corrupt. You can see that the perception of corruption declines. And so if you're looking for a government that is perceived to be cleaner and has more legitimacy in the eyes of the population, then you know that having women's participation can help you in achieving that goal. But I think that there's an important question we need to ask now that we are starting to see the critical mass of women's participation in elective office increasing, which is, that is a necessary precursor for having representative government. But is their participation sufficient for achieving all of the good that we think is achieved? And I think the jury is still out on that. We don't necessarily see women where they have critical mass having the kind of influence we would hope that they could have in these societies around the world. Their presence is not necessarily always equating with the kind of impact that we might see. So in some countries, in many countries in fact, we see certain thematic issues being brought to the fore by women, whether it's social investments in health and education, or whether it's a focus on gender-based violence. And you do see attention to issues like sexual violence, to harmful traditional practices, to domestic violence coming out time and again when you have women coming into office, whether it's Pakistan, whether it's Rwanda, whether it's in Europe and Eurasia. These are the issues that female legislators are bringing to the fore, or here in the United States as well. But that's not always the case. So when we look at women as legislators and we think, all right, how do we translate these growing numbers into influence? I think there are a number of lessons we can draw. We need to help women create caucuses where they can work across party lines so that their influence is derivative of their status across their party roles. We need to help women increase the quality of their participation through both the skills that they possess and the feeder systems that exist within the system, either through parties or through local level offices, so that the women that start to come into positions of power are women who are in possession of skills and experience that allow them to be outspoken and influential. We need to create space for women to work with other women. Too often we're seeing that women are beholden to the party systems through which they grow, and it's essential for them to be able to work as women outside of those party systems and to have increased influence within the parties in order to enable them to have that influence. And finally, we need to be strengthening the linkages between the women in government and the women in civil society. Because as we know, 20% is just barely getting there, and that's only an international average. And there is only going to be strength in numbers, and these women need to be supported by women outside of government in order to have the influence that they can have. Let me turn for a minute to the role of all of you who are working in election systems and women as voters, because essential to translating the power of women within politics and political systems will also be the role of women as voters. And if we think about how we make sure that that translates into influence, then we need to think about how we're getting information out to potential voters and potential candidates, recognizing that women receive information differently than do men. And that if we're just looking at channels of communication writ large, we may not be reaching everybody within the electorate. Similarly, we need to think about where we're putting voting booths, who we're appointing as voting monitors, who are on our electoral commissions and at different levels of our electoral commissions. Because if those aren't representative of society, we're not going to have the representation that we need in the voting booth or as those running for offices. We need to think about when polls are open and whether those polls are open at the times when women are available and whether they're able to get to those polling stations in places where their mobility is constrained. Only when we think about these issues writ large are we going to truly fulfill our collective mandate to ensure that governance is representative and that all of those in populations have their voices heard in the electoral process. Now, Jessica, you asked why it is that we're having all of these executive orders, creating lots of different policies and strategies, and I want to conclude with that. The U.S. government has wholly changed the framework for dealing with issues related to women's political participation globally, whether it's on issues related to gender-based violence, their role in building in peace building and in the participation in peace processes, their role in promoting good governance and being part of electoral systems and political processes writ large around the world. And the reason we're doing that is because we cannot have the most effective U.S. foreign policy that serves the interests of partner countries abroad unless we are focused for very, very pragmatic reasons on ensuring women a voice and role globally. So no longer do we think about issues related to women's participation in political processes or, frankly, in any other aspect of foreign policy as a women's issue. We now, today, think of it as essential to our success and to our success in partnering with your nations around the world to think about how we are as effective and efficacious as we can be in promoting democracies and good governance. And I think you saw that, for me, one of the high points of the presidential debates, though it was a small, perhaps unnoticed high point for many of you, was in the third debate between the president and Mr. Romney, when both the president and Mr. Romney referred to gender equality as critical elements of U.S. foreign policy. And in fact, my brother called me and he said, "Carla, they practically said your name." I said, "Well, no, not exactly. But when we see the two male major party candidates talking about gender equality as essential to U.S. foreign policy, I feel like we're making progress. And what's essential is for us to work all together to think about the best, most effective ways to make sure that we fulfill the promise of women around the world as candidates, as elected officials, and as voters. Because until we do that, we're not doing the best that we can in terms of promoting democracy and good governance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Carla, for giving us that international perspective from the very pragmatic appreciation that women in politics is better for all society and evidence that supports that, to the importance of having true impact and influence from women's political participation and improving the quality of women's participation in political systems. And finally, a very pragmatic point you made there at the end about gender equality being essential to U.S. foreign policy is a very interesting and important way to look at that. Thank you very much. I think we have time for some questions.
My name is Stephanus Dafwang from the Electoral Commission of Nigeria. I think we would, most of us men would agree with the suggestion that we should do whatever we can to enhance the participation of women in politics. But I think also that there's a lot that women can do to enhance their own participation. I think we underrate their complementary role to their husbands. It's a very important role, and I know that the first African First Ladies are actually together and are doing everything possible to ensure that their husbands, who are presidents of these countries, increase the participation of women. In Nigeria, for example, they were able to get the president to make a commitment that there must be 35% of women in all appointments. So I think I think those of you who are involved in mobilizing women should give credit to men who are cooperating and assisting in everywhere possible, even to their wives, to participate actively. I've seen another extreme which I actually would want you to comment on. In some parts of South Africa, I think South Africa is here, there's a legislation that 50% of appointments must be women. Now, I would prefer a situation where women participation increases naturally. I mean, today, if all the legislative, all the women in the all the legislatures, people in the legislature of Nigeria are women. If they evolve naturally, I will have no problem with that. But when you legislate and say 50% must be women, in that regard, you bring in women who may not necessarily have the capacity to perform in that particular office. I don't know what you will say about that.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to split those two questions. I'm going to ask Ann Stone to answer the first question about credit to the husbands. And perhaps, Carla, if you could speak to the second point about quotas, really, about the importance of, or not, of quotas. Thank you.
Well, I might actually sneak in a question, or the answer about quotas if I make it real fast. Anyway. Absolutely. We celebrate men who support women no matter at what level, whether it's the husband supporting the wife to be active or the community supporting the women to run. All are important for society. And that was my point. Getting them involved politically helps civil society, whether they choose to run or not. Quotas sometimes are necessary. We don't use it in the United States, so it's ironic because we've advocated it other places.
All right, I'm going to break the rules too and answer both. I think that first of all, this all needs to be a partnership between men and women, and you're not going to get anywhere unless men are supporting women in office at every level. Even insofar as figuring out how to balance childcare responsibilities so that women or men can be in office and also be caring for children, all the way to the issue of first ladies and their activism or women in public office. With regard to the issue of quotas, I mean, I think what we found is that quotas in many places are essential to jump-starting women's participation in public office. There are many ways to structure quotas. I don't know the specific circumstances of the 50% quota, but sometimes those quotas can be temporary measures to increase the comfort that the electorate feels with voting for women and putting them in office, and for increasing the level of comfort that women feel running for office and holding those positions. There's an interesting quota now in Kenya. It's the first, I believe, in the world that says it needs to be, I guess it's 30% of each sex, and then the rest can be whatever, to make sure that you're not prejudging whether it needs to be exactly 50%. In many places, it's 20 or 25%. But I would caution us to say that you cannot find women who are qualified to take office, because in many cases, and I know the gentleman in front of me from Afghanistan can probably speak to this, the women who are in the parliament in Afghanistan, many of them are much more highly educated than many of the men who are in the parliament in Afghanistan. And I don't think people are necessarily asking the same questions of men that they're asking of women when they come into elected office. And so we just have to be cautious in the expectations that we set, and whether they're expectations that are universally applied.
Thank you. I know there's a couple of questions in the audience. Just one second. I did just get another question about quotas, so I think this might be something we want to spend a few more minutes on. Sure. And a very relevant follow-up question from somebody in the audience is, what about the quota issue in the United States system?
We don't have one.
We don't have one. We do have within internal party politics on the Democratic side, a 50% of our internal appointments are supposed to be, and they pretty much are, 50% of the delegates to a Democratic convention, 50% of the members of national committees. That has worked pretty well because it gives women on the way up some visibility, some of those skills you were talking about, Carl, that women need on the way in to learn how to work within the system. But we don't have, and I would say given how important we take sort of personal decision-making, are not going to have quotas at any other general election level.
The other thing I would just add in the United States is it's been extremely slow process to increase the numbers of women in these offices.
We've noticed, yes.
Yeah. And in fact had some losses, you know, in the last, decreases in the last election cycle. So there isn't much political support for broader quotas, but that doesn't mean it wouldn't jumpstart levels of participation.
But the interesting thing is, in the Republican Party, we also have split 50-50 for party committees and all that. And the interesting thing is those governors and those party chairs who've recognized the importance of women and have made a concerted effort, we found that it was actually easier to elect women as Republicans than it was to not. And in New York State, for example, Bill Powers, who was the chairman, made a concerted effort to get women to run at all levels as Republicans. And when Hillary Clinton was elected to the Senate in New York, at that time, more of the offices were held by elected Republican women at all, if you went from the local level up, than Democratic elected men at that time, because of the fact that the state party chairman recognized and pushed hard to get them to run. Thank you.
Thank you. Willem Smirnov, Russia. The title of this plenary is very broad, women political participation. That's why it inspired me for two questions. First one is about the role of women in political parties, American political parties, and in the electoral campaign is the first question. The second one, maybe too broad. What, from your point of view, additional legal means could be introduced or developed to increase the gender equality in politics, in U.S. politics? Thank you.
Thank you. I think that both of those questions were quite relevant, and in fact, the first question you asked about the role of women in the electoral campaign has been asked by a few people. So I don't know if people want to speak on that, and then also maybe Anne, if you want to say something about the question about legal, any additional legal means.
Legal, yeah, we do prefer legal means, yes, when possible. All right, let's talk for a moment. As I say, you were here at a really important and historic time, watching the last 2 days of this presidential and Senate election. And you will see, I suspect, if Mr. Sweeney here gives you any time off at all where you get to your hotel room, no, they have no time. So they'll never see a commercial. You'll see a commercial or two, because you're really in the heart of a very hotly contested Senate race where I noticed this morning, for example, one of the ads for the Virginia Senate race is about women who are teachers, who are saying how important education is, and they did not go into teaching to be famous, but to do well for children, and one of the candidates is better than others, and that is immediately followed by a commercial for that the other candidate, the one who's being attacked, and he's speaking in a classroom full of children, explaining that education is very close to his heart. The second one is, again, same campaign, a series of women who are saying that the candidate they're opposing doesn't understand my life and doesn't understand my health care. And you see this woman, and then you see blocks sort of covering her, parts of her, and explaining, to dramatize the difference. So I think you will see, again, in these campaigns, while there is not a woman candidate for Senate in Virginia, the ways in which women and the issues, again, considered to be important to them are really featured on those television ads. We'll give you an example. And then, as I say, I think you saw the kind of document I was showing, which start with what the 2012 election means for women. And that is a headline on this one. So as we get closer to Election Day, we're pretty close now, no surprise, it's about the numbers. In 2008, 10 million more women than men voted. Now, 10 million is a nice round number. 10 million more. I don't know what the margin will be tomorrow, but it is, again, very likely millions more women than men will go to the polls. That distribution is particularly important because at young women are a little more likely to vote than young men, and because young and older women are a little more likely to outlive older men. You just have more women in the electorate. So watch that. You will see lots of examples of women as spokespeople, as sort of models, speaking in the ads and out on the stage. And I think, again, I encourage you to see it for yourselves.
Thank you. Carla, you wanted to say something.
I think there are other strategies beyond quotas that can be used. If you peel back the onion to see why it is women often aren't running for office or why they don't win when they run, you know that they often have less money. Often they don't like the image of government because they don't think it's a clean profession. They don't have access to the media. And so you can do things like set legal requirements of equal time on television so that it's not that people can't have access to the media or to radio to talk about their platforms just because they lack money. You can have public financing laws or laws governing the amount of money that can be spent on certain elections so that you create a platform that's a level playing field even when people don't necessarily have the financial resources, or set limits on the financing. You can legislate in party distribution of financing or create incentives for female candidates. So you say, you know, you can get X amount of public financing for your party, but you can get X plus 10% if you have a certain percentage of women there. And you can also try to do an aggressive anti-corruption campaigns that will change the image of government and thereby draw more women into running for office. So those are all other legal strategies that can be used to increase women's participation.
But I'll tell you, laws aside, and here in the United States that stuff won't happen. It may be useful in your countries. However, you got to change the mindset. And that's part of where the women's history stuff comes from. And in fact, if more women knew their history internationally, more women would run for office. Quick example, Judy Renfrew, who's head of our development team for our museum, had a 6-year-old daughter who was 6 when Hillary was running. She and her sister were having an argument. She said, "It's a lie. Hillary Clinton can't be president." And she said to her daughter, "Why would you say such a thing? It's against the law." "Why would you say that it's against?" "Because she's a girl." "Well, what do you mean it's against the law?" "Well, if it wasn't against the law, a woman already would be."
I have about 8 questions in the queue, so I just bear with me. Bill, if you could.
I'm Bill Sweeney. I just have one point to make, and that is in all the conversation about women being involved in running for office and being candidates, an important role has been missed in the panel's presentation, and that's women who run election commissions and women's roles in election commissions. We have a number of very progressive men in this audience who have created women's departments, women's outreach. Women in particular cultures are extraordinarily needed as poll workers so that women can vote in accord with their cultural customs and not speak to men outside their family. Along with security concerns, we need women employed as security personnel, again because of cultural customs, so that women can confirm their identity by taking off their veil in front of another woman, or by taking off their gloves so as to dip their finger in ink to verify that they vote without taking off their glove in front of the other sex. These are important roles that are oftentimes not thought of. And frankly, this panel is addressing more women leaders of election commissions than probably assembled in any other meeting of democracy advocates. We've got chairs of women commissions, my friend the Star from Guatemala, the acting chair of the Liberia Commission, my good friend who was a politician in the Philippines and is now an election commissioner. So that part of the political process I need you to highlight.
I knew this was a distinguished audience. I just didn't realize how distinguished. Thank you for reminding us. And to all of you, we talked about other legal means, and I think Bill's giving us some very good examples in whatever role you play towards the election process, looking at the ways in which you can highlight, sometimes just a little bit, but making sure that women play the role.
Thank you. 2 questions from the audience, Daniela and then Alex.
Merci. Je vais poser ma question.
Thank you very much. I'm going to speak in French, if I may. I am from the Democratic Republic of Congo, And I am very, very grateful to all of you who have intervened and all of you on the panel for your very good statements. I'd like to ask a question to the lady who intervened last, who made the point that if more were done worldwide to do more for women in having access in decision-making positions, this would have a multiplying effect. You talked about 17 countries that have, or have had, or have heads of state who are women. And you also said, how can we improve the quality of representation, you mentioned, among other things. And I wondered, I had hoped that she would answer that question that she included, I believe, in her comments. And I think it's an important issue. What can we do, yes, to improve the representation of women in politics, but the quality of that representation? Sure, there's discrimination against women. Sure, there is all kinds of discrimination and negative projects which don't only happen here, heaven knows, but are endemic worldwide. But the question of improving the quality of women's representation, I would love you to answer that. How can we improve the representativeness of women at the decision-making level, I'm talking, and what strategies might we dream up to that end? Thanks very much.
Carla. Do you want me to answer now, or do you want to take the other question?
Let me take the other question. Alex.
Yes, hello. I'm the Chief Justice of the Electoral Court of Panama, and I have been promoting gender equality in Panama. I have failed. We didn't pass the law. I noticed a lot of resistance from senators that are females because they made it through the male system, and they don't want competition. What do you feel about gender affirmative actions? Specifically, rules of equality, forcing equality after the election, if women are not elected. How do you feel about that? And just for general information, if there is a quota in the States or in Europe, if there is not a quota, what's the percentage of women running for senators? And what is the percentage of women elected? I agree with you that it's 20% pretty much around the world. Argentina did an excellent job. They went from 20% to 40%. Mexico also has a great percentage of women participating in Senate. So I don't know, what do you feel about affirmative action forcing equality after the election?
Thank you. I'm going to ask Carla to speak on the first point, and Lewis to speak on the second point, because we have another question on this theme of the reluctance of women to support women candidates, and I think it's important to address. And Ann Stone, if you want to jump in on that second question as well, that would be great.
Thank you for the question. I think that I think there are a number of strategies that can be used to improve the quality of the participation of women. The first thing I would say is, though, we should be a little bit patient, that the studies show that it takes a couple of election cycles and you start to see improvements in the participation of the women who are elected, both because the women who are running for office change and the people who are there gain experience, and that's quite natural and to be expected. But I think that there are a couple of essential components. One is to put in place training, and particularly training for newly elected officials. I was working with newly elected officials in a number of countries, women, and they're elected to office, but they don't necessarily know everything about how the system functions. And so sometimes teaching what their role is and how they can play that role, how the parties function and how they can have influence, what their role is as legislators or in different offices can be really important. It's the next step after the training related to running for office. So now you're in office. And you should all be aware that in the United States, we'll have elections tomorrow, and before those people take office, every new elected official goes for training to learn how to now be a congressperson, and what that means, and what their roles are, and what are Robert's Rules of Orders as applied within Congress, and how to work that way. So this is not something that is unique to developing nations or nations outside the United States. We have to offer that training for our system to function. I think the second is creating organizations that allow women from different political parties to meet outside of the structures of those parties. And sometimes women's caucuses are arranged, but there's a representative of each party that goes to the caucus meetings. I don't think that's an effective way of doing it. The way you need to do it is you need to allow all women to meet on their own terms to discuss what their priorities are as women, not what their priorities are through the prism of their political party, so that you can help them develop an agenda which is an agenda for women and how they can join forces on certain issues, notwithstanding their disagreement or their party's disagreement on other issues. The third thing I think is critical is helping them, that is newly elected women officials, get in touch with women who are not in office, women in civil society, both so that they have their fingers on the pulse of those in those societies, and so that they can develop their base, a base of women who will support them in office and will keep them grounded and aware of the issues on the ground. And I think that if those strategies are followed, we start to see women elected officials who are fulfilling more of the promise.
I just want to add something on that last point, the connection between women in civil society and in political parties. I just returned from Libya, where IFES is working with women both in civil society and in the elected officials, and as elected officials. And I have to say, both sides were not speaking to each other, and both sides were saying we need to speak with each other, and that they found it mutually beneficial. So finding ways to make those connections, I think, is critically important, as well as
Yeah, go ahead.
no, as well as the caucusing beyond the political parties.
I think the other point, to Bill's point earlier, is that women in positions of authority should get together from their positions in election commissions, from their positions as leaders in government, in executive branches, in legislative branches. There's an incredibly important networking function that needs to be created and fulfilled. And that's what will enable this to become a self-sustaining process. And so, to all of the leaders in the room who are focused on the election system, the connection with the women in elected office and the women who are running for office is really essential to ensuring that women have their rightful influence in the process writ large.
Thank you. And on this, just on the second point that the gentleman from Panama made.
Yes. I was going to say, I also have this question from the chairman of elections of the Cameroon. Now, is this Dr. Foncam? Yes? May I just say, thank you, sir, for quoting one of the great women in American history, Sojourner Truth. So Ann Stone and I, both with our interest in women history, always appreciate hearing her name invoked. And your question was, why are women, and this was not on behalf of Sojourner Truth. I got to separate those out. But she's always a good person to have in our mind as our guiding spirit. Your question was, why are women so reluctant to vote for other women? Is the best way of ensuring representation, not through the imposition of quotas. Let me say first, it is always regrettable if you find that women are reluctant to vote for other women. It is sometimes understandable if you've grown up your whole life thinking that only a very few women are going to make it. Then you might think that other women are your competition when they should be your colleagues. And what is critically important is to help them understand that they will be more powerful, more effective, and by the way, more politically popular if they work with other women rather than against them. And some of those ideas you have heard from Carla. The first is the idea of a caucus, which can increase your ability to move votes within the legislature. If you have a caucus with women from other parties, you learn more about what's going on in those parties. You're able sometimes to put together more votes for bills you care about. So that's the first part. The second is a more informal system. I talked earlier about my friend Barbara Mikulski, who got elected to the United States Senate and is now the dean of U.S. senators. Every 2 years, she has an introductory tea for newly elected women senators of both parties, and she calls them power teas. And she calls them power teas because a reporter once asked her, when she said she was inviting the women over, was she having them for tea? So she said yes, power teas, and that's what they have been ever since. But she walks through with them the rules of the Senate, informally, how to get what you want, how to get good things for your district, shall we say. So she welcomes newly elected women and says, we're all in this together. I will try to help you be a more effective senator. So the second way is if there is a senior or a leading woman within the body who can take on that kind of role. And the third, cannot stress this too much, and you heard it from Carla, and you've heard it from Jessica, the question of making that link with civil society. When women in civil society link directly to elected women and say, we are looking to you, we count on you to represent all of us, that gives them an additional power base. So they don't just have to depend on the men in their party. And again, it can enable them to be even more effective and better grounded. And each of those can help increase women's working together.
We're about to run out of time. I just want to pick up on the gentleman from Panama's point, and I think it's also related to this, which is that once women are elected, perhaps they lose interest, or do they lose interest in gender equality because they fought in a system that didn't necessarily support that.
I think that was true in the old days. I think it's becoming less true. It was even true in the United States in the old days, and I think it's becoming less true. But also to further expand on what was said to the gentleman from Cameroon, the 5 points I gave you, the women in other countries have actually used to convince women that they should support them. And they came back and told me when they've addressed the women audiences and they've given the 5 reasons, the women look at them and go, wow, we never thought about that before. Okay, there is a reason to have women in the room. Before then, they were saying, no, you should stay home, take care of your kids, take care of your husband, don't venture in. But they explain it's good for everybody if they participate, and it makes a big difference.
There's just an additional question here, a bit related to that, and I'm wondering if one of the panelists has an answer to it, which is, are there studies about the patriarchal system that prevents women from having power or being represented? Do any of you have some suggestions of studies on the important, perhaps maybe to put it in a positive, the importance of gender equality in terms of increasing women's representation?
Mm-hmm. Again, I guess I would say there are studies that show that countries that survive and thrive and whose economies are the strongest tend to have women fully participating. As I said earlier, there is a study as to which governments are most beloved by their people, and they generally tend to have women, not just in elective office, they have women throughout their government.
Thank you. And Carla?
There are case studies of how the women's political participation has translated into certain types of legislation and prioritization. There is this research in India on what the results of their legislating has been for local level investment and decision making, as well as aspirations at the local level. And then there are general studies about the role of women in government. And I'd be happy to send some of the links to some of those to Jessica. They could be sent forward. I think the point is important, though, in terms of the issue of getting other women to support other women. The way you frame that argument matters a lot, because I think some of these women were very lonely in their positions of power because there was 1 or 2 of them, and they fought really hard to get there, but once they were there, they had very little influence. And so if you can say to them, look, imagine a world in which, you know, you're the 2 most senior women, but you have a cadre of people who are beholden to you for helping open the door, and now you have a whole block that will vote with you and elevate your authority, it becomes a different message for them.
Thank you. I'm going to take one last, as long as it's a very quick question, and then also say that we're actually going to break for a few minutes, but continue the conversation. And it sounds to me like there are quite a few questions and comments that still need to be vetted when we talk about our IFES Women's Electoral Leadership Liaison Network that we're hoping to launch with you here in the room today. So if you want to...
One question and one...
Okay.
Sorry.
It's okay. We'll start here, and then we'll move to... I'll squeeze in 2 questions.
Is it...
Comments. Go ahead.
Okay.
Please.
Yeah, I have one question, very short, as you said, Jessica. This is about the electoral violence when women are giving candidacy, and do you think that these women are given equal chance as men in the electoral competition? Whether you have done any study in the developing democracy or not, that is one question. And second, I have some bit of information that I like to share with you. Is Nepal has been electing more than 33% women in the national parliament, which has been great success, but then we have never had very good representation at the local level. I like to mention, Carla has pointed out the Indian local government representation, but then India has never allowed the legislation to go to the national parliament for women's representation in proportionality. So what is basically the problem in the democracy to make the inclusive representation of women? What would be the best solution for us to take home?
Okay, thank you. And then we'll just take this question over here as well.
I would like to point out that I have listened with great interest to the panelists and have noted that not one of them referred to women's participation in the third power, which is the judiciary. Now, sovereignty is not only exercised directly through elections, but also indirectly through the elected authorities who then appoint the judiciary members. I know that in the US there are female judges on the Supreme Court, but in other countries also. In my country, at the judiciary, 60% of the officials are women. So I do believe it's important not only to focus on the direct election of women, but also women's participation in the most important power of government, the judiciary, which will ensure the well-being of citizens. So I just wanted to ask about that. Why are you not talking about the third power?
To give people a break before the IFES Well session, if I could ask panelists to touch on these last points made by the two gentlemen on electoral violence and limiting women's participation, the problem of inclusivity at the local level, I think, and then this last point made about the judiciary, as well as any final comments you want to make. We'll start with Anne.
Thank you for reminding us of the judiciary, which clearly is a very, very important factor in democratic government. I think the reason, for example, I did not is the ways in which judges are appointed in our country is so varied. So in some states, they're elected. In some, they're appointed. Having said that, I would go back to my last point, which is there is a direct connection between the number of women who get elected to office and all the other decision-making positions that are then held by women. So the participation of women in the political process, as candidates, as voters, again, as officials, is consistent, and you will find that it will also result in more women as judges. And if this is my, again, last comment, thanks to all of you for the work you do every day on behalf of elections. It really has been my pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Anne.
If I might also say then, my concluding remarks on how to get more women to run for office that are more effective, as one of the questions was asked, or how to get them elected even without a quota system, I would say what you have to do, and many of the people in this room already are doing this, is to give women support at all levels. It has to start with support in the home, support in the schools, where they talk about women being involved, making it acceptable, support in the culture. How many of you have television shows that ever feature women as pundits or women in elective office to show other people in your countries that women are participating? Support certainly by their husbands, support by their fathers and their brothers, and showing that they're encouraging the women in their family to be more involved. It has to be support at all levels. and also inspiring them by featuring women's history and showing the part women have played. One little last surprise, perhaps, in the United States, if you asked how many women have run for president in the United States, most Americans would tell you, oh, only 2 or 3, when in fact 35 women have run for office for the presidency in the United States. And even that history is lost to Americans. So it's a matter of, again, support and encouragement at all levels in all different ways. And I thank you, as Anne did, for the part that you're playing by being here today and by what you do back in your countries. We thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne. Carla.
I don't know enough about the Nepali structures to be authoritative in terms of what advice I would give you. But there are a number of different ways you could think about it. I mean, some countries have created women-only ballots so that everybody is voting for women, and it gets people used to the idea of voting for women, and then they eliminate the women-only ballot, but the women continue to be elected. It may be the positions that people have on lists, if you have, in your party list, so you may have female candidates, but they're always placed very low, in which case the solution would be something related to working with parties and where they're placing women. So there are a number of different strategies that have been used in different places, and I'd be happy to stay in touch and think more specifically about what makes sense in the context of Nepal. Thanks to all of you for the work you're doing. Thanks to IFES for organizing this conversation. I have to say, for a 4:45, 5 p.m., a Monday afternoon conversation, this is a very lively and robust dialogue on this topic. And if that's indicative, and I hope it is, of the commitment you all have to cracking this nut and making sure that systems around the world are inclusive and representative, then I hold out great hope for robust democracies around the world. So thank you all for that, and thank you for joining us at a historic moment in time in the United States. And I'll be eager to hear the readout from Bill and from Jessica of how you debrief on Wednesday following the visit to see our polling places and to hear the results of our election. So just my gratitude and appreciation.
Thank you, Carla. And listen, I have a few practical announcements, but before I get to those, I want to thank our panelists and ask you all in the audience also to give them a warm round of applause.